Hello, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 191, and I am the show's host, Kyle. As I'm sure most of you expect on today's show, I'm going to be going through Trump's announcement that the United States is withdrawing from the nuclear agreement with Iran. So, not going to waste too much time. We're going to get right into Trump's speech here. For those of you who want to share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, and it's on the libertarianinstitute.org as well. All right, so Trump gave the speech on May 8th. He had until the 12th to either sign a waiver saying that for the next 3 months, the United States would continue to keep sanctions off of Iran per the nuclear agreement, or the United States would be out of compliance with the nuclear agreement. So Trump gave a press conference that I believe he announced on the 7th yesterday, in which he announced the United States was withdrawing from the agreement. And so, without too much other introduction, I'm just going to hop right into that speech. At a couple points, he gets pretty redundant in here. He keeps saying, Iran funds terrorism. And so while, I just cut out anything that's redundant and just kept in the most relevant stuff. And I think he sets me up pretty well to debunk most of the myths you're going to be hearing about the Iran nuclear agreement and why the United States decided to withdraw. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and play the first clip.
My fellow Americans, today I want to update the world on our efforts to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. The Iranian regime is the leading state sponsor of terror. It exports dangerous missiles, fuels conflicts across the Middle East, and supports terrorist proxies and militias such as Hezbollah, Hamas, the Taliban, and al-Qaeda. Over the years, Iran and its proxies have bombed American embassies.
All right, so he leads off that first clip by saying, I'm going to update you on our efforts to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Now, that statement supposes that Iran is actively trying to or wants to get a nuclear weapon and has to be prevented from doing so. But that's simply not the case. Both the CIA and the IAEA, which I'll be referring to a lot, and that's the international watchdog group that's tasked with enforcing the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT, and the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is also known as the Iran Nuclear Agreement, Nuke Deal, Iran Nuke Deal, whatever people want to call it. Both of those groups, CIA and IAEA, assess that Iran stopped trying to make a nuclear weapon in 2003. And the IAEA's report goes a little bit further and says that Iran wasn't actively trying to build a nuclear weapon, but was just making assessments on what it would take to build a nuclear weapon. Some people have even gone further and suggested that Iran was only doing so because they wanted to know how far away Saddam Hussein was from getting a nuclear weapon. And if you would remember back to 2001, 2002, this is something that the United States was concerned about as well. It wouldn't have just been Iran. And of course, Iran was not a long time enemy, but was an enemy since the 1980s of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And Saddam Hussein in Iraq used brutal tactics, not only against his own people in Iraq, but also against the Iranian people, using gas against them. And then if you'll remember, what happened in 2003 was that the United States went in and fought a war against Saddam Hussein and defeated his army and overthrew his government. And so at least, there is some circumstantial evidence to suggest that once the Iraqi threat was dealt with, Iran stopped attempting to make nuclear weapons. Now, some people, I think, on the other side of the coin would, say, well, the evidence then suggests that Iran was so scared of what happened to Saddam in Iraq that they decided to stop making or looking to make nuclear weapons. However, you have a similar situation occurring at the same time with North Korea, and North Korea decided to take the route of pursuing nuclear weapons. So, that theory doesn't really seem to apply. And so if you actually look at Iran, the Iranian government isn't looking to get a nuclear weapon. For what it's worth, and it's probably not a whole lot, but the Ayatollah did issue a fatwa, which is, a religious edict saying that the Iranian government isn't, and it basically just says that the Iranian government is religiously forbidden from seeking nuclear weapons. And I believe he's also capped the Iranian missile program at 2,000 kilometers. And so immediately after making this bold claim that Iran needs to be stopped from getting nuclear weapons, because that's essentially what he's saying, he doesn't then go into offering proof that Iran is making nuclear weapons. In fact, he doesn't do that throughout this entire speech. What he goes into saying is that Iran is the leading state sponsor of terrorism, and then cites Hezbollah, Hamas, the Taliban, and Al-Qaeda as the groups that Iran support. Now, Iran is, the government there, and, the portions of the government that the United States finds most offensive is, the religious portion. That's a Shia government of Iran. The Ayatollah is a Shia. Now, the Sunni, the Taliban are Sunnis, and at least prior to 2001, had conflicts with their neighboring Iranian state, and not necessarily wars, but I believe the Taliban would target and kill Iranian diplomats and stuff like that. Also, there are Shia groups within Afghanistan. I believe the Hazaras are the Shias, and Iran would have reason to bat those groups, and those groups oppose the Taliban. And since the United States took over in 2001 and formed our own government there, the Hazaras have been fighting against the Taliban. If you go to Al-Qaeda and just look at the Syrian battlefield, who is Iran fighting in Syria? It's Al-Qaeda. Who did Iran fight against, or, what side of the war did Iran fight on during the Iraqi civil war? And that was for the Shia against the Sunni resistance, and that was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who later went on to become ISIS, who then Iran fought another war against in Iraq when ISIS took a large portion of territory, Mosul, Fallujah, Ramadi, Tikrit. If you look at Hamas, this is a much more complicated situation, as the Israeli government has really created Hamas, and it's become a problem for Israel in relation to their oppression of the Palestinian people. And Iran definitely takes the side of the Palestinians in that conflict, but in a lot of ways, that's not the wrong side to be on there. It's, the Palestinians are the victims of the Israeli policy, and that's the policy of the Iranians. When you look at Hezbollah, Hezbollah is not a terrorist group, and in fact, Trump kind of moderates his statement to say that the Iranian support for militias and terrorist groups, because Hezbollah doesn't do the terrorist activities. They don't behead people. They don't carry out suicide bombings, at least not anymore, since the occupation of southern Lebanon ended by Israel in 2006. And in the Syrian civil war, Hezbollah has been one of the strongest supporters of Assad, fighting against the terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, al-Nusra, or HTS, whatever you want to call them. Now, he then goes on to blame Iran for various other crimes, either Iran or their proxies. And so, he chalks up terrorist attacks that were carried out by Al-Qaeda as somehow being responsible for the Iranian government. When you look at the type of organization that Al-Qaeda is, especially post-2001 in the U.S. terrorist war, they're a Sunni jihadist group whose fundamental teachings are based in Saudi Wahhabism, and, some of the ISIS guys are more of Salafist. And so, these are the opponents of the Shia Ayatollah, kind of IRGC, Iranian military corps. I'm going to go ahead and move on to clip 2 now.
The Iranian regime has funded its long reign of chaos and terror by plundering the wealth of its own people. No action taken by the regime has been more dangerous than its pursuit of nuclear weapons and the means of delivering them.
Okay, so the first part here, I don't necessarily disagree with that. The Iranian government has taken money from the Iranian people and used it to fight against terrorist groups in Syria, Iraq, and provide some support to Hamas and Hezbollah. Like, this has happened, and to some extent, it's probably supported by some of the people of Iran, but in a lot of other ways, Iran is struggling economically for reasons that aren't completely, attributable to all their military interventionism. But the same is very true for the United States of America, and for Trump to use this as any kind of justification from withdrawing from the Iranian nuclear agreement is ridiculous. It's just another one of his smears on the Iranian government. And, I just wanted to mention that, this one, there's a little truth to. It's just complete hypocrisy because it's the president of the United States saying it. He then goes on to talk about how the most dangerous thing the Iranians have ever done is look to get nuclear weapons. And as I've already talked about, he kind of keeps doing this, where he keeps framing it as, we know the Iranians want to get nuclear weapons, when that's simply not the case. All right, now I'm going to play a clip.
In theory, the so-called Iran deal was supposed to protect the United States and our allies from the lunacy of an Iranian nuclear bomb, a weapon that will only endanger the survival of the Iranian regime. In fact, the deal allowed Iran to continue enriching uranium and, over time, reach the brink of a nuclear breakout. The deal lifted crippling economic sanctions on Iran in exchange for very weak limits on the regime's nuclear activity and no limits at all on its other malign behavior, including its sinister activities in Syria, Yemen, and other places all around the world.
All right, so right in this next section, I'm going to get into a lot of meat of the actual JCPOA and if Iran was actually violating it. To understand the JCPOA, you have to kind of understand that there's a non-proliferation treaty, which is an agreement signed by, I think, almost all the countries of the world, minus Israel, India, and Pakistan, who have developed nuclear weapons since the start of the NPT. And Israel is actually a country with a secret nuclear weapons program that they don't openly admit to. And Israel also has, and it's very much worth knowing, a nuclear triad capable of delivering missiles either by air, by their Jericho missiles, or through a submarine. Now, Iran has been a longtime signatory to the NPT. I think before 2003, as I was saying, Iran had made some explorations into researching what it would take to make a nuclear weapon and was found to have violated some of the safeguards of the NPT. However, post-2003, it hasn't been proven that Iran was in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So under the Obama administration, we have this situation where Obama looks to make an agreement with Iran where Iran would agree to additional restrictions, protocols, and inspections on their nuclear energy program that they use to produce energy, that's used to keep the AC running and the lights on in the homes of the Iranian people. They would agree to additional limitations on that energy program, and in exchange, the Western countries and the world would take some sanctions off of Iran. Now, this agreement came with concessions up front with Iran, including destroying over half of their nuclear centrifuges that are used to take the nuclear waste and spin it down to enrich uranium, a critical thing that you would have to do if you were making a nuclear weapon, although it could just be used for nuclear fuel as well. And they would also destroy their heavy water reactor. The heavy water produced by the heavy water reactor can much more easily be spun down by centrifuges and enriched to a level where they could be turned into fuel for nuclear energy or a nuclear bomb. And so Iran poured concrete into their heavy water reactor, destroying it at the start of the nuclear agreement. The nuclear agreement also required Iran to limit its stockpile of nuclear fuel or enriched uranium. And in fact, Iran agreed to give up for the next 10 years, hold only 5% of the uranium that Iran once held. Inspectors would also be given 24-hour access to all of Iran's nuclear sites, either monitored in person or by camera. And then there was also a system set up that if a country was able to provide evidence to the countries that signed the nuclear agreement, and only a majority of them would have to say so, then the IAEA would be able to go and visit and inspect any site in Iran. And so let's say Israel believed that Iran was making a nuclear weapon at a secret underground facility somewhere in Iran, and they were simply able to convince the United States, the UK, France, and Germany of this, which are, all Western countries and typically fall in line on our foreign policy. I mean, remember that the UK and France went along with the United States in our strikes against Assad's army in Syria. I guess I can't say army, but Assad controlled territory in Syria, right? Then the IAEA would be able to inspect any site within Iran. And there was a lot of controversy over this at the time, and I remember hearing that them saying, there's a possible 21-day delay on this, and Iran would be able to stall. But at the end of the day, the IAEA was giving the ability to inspect any site within Iran, should just those four Western countries say that there was evidence to do so. And so when Trump says that the Iran deal was made to protect the United States and our allies, I mean, I guess this is kind of true because the United States and our allies had the ability to inspect any site within Iran that we believe there's possible nuclear activity. However, the United States wasn't protecting itself from anything because Iran wasn't seeking nuclear weapons in the first place. He makes an interesting statement here by saying that getting a bomb will endanger Iran. And it's like, I don't know, maybe a forewarning to Iran because as I'll talk about later in the show, North Korea ended up getting a nuclear weapon after the United States kicked them out of a treaty. So, I don't know, maybe Trump's worried about that happening here. But he's saying that this would be really bad for Iran to get a nuclear weapon. And it seems that to some extent, the government of Iran agrees with Trump and they're not seeking to make a nuclear weapon. Now, Trump pretends that the deal will allow Iran to be on the brink of a nuclear weapon when the sunsets expire. And again, this isn't true because this is just an additional protocol, additional limitations on Iran's nuclear energy program, in addition to what the NPT is, which all the countries in the world are signatories to. And the United States isn't constantly saying, well, it looks like Turkey's moving close to a nuclear weapon now. It looks like Egypt's doing it. You know, all these countries will be under the exact same agreement that Iran is. And there's no evidence that Iran was pursuing a bomb from 2003 till 2015 before the deal was signed. And so, you know, there's this like pretense and like people pretend that somehow in 10 years, so in 2025, Iran will just have a nuclear weapon and that Iran won't have the same limitations on their nuclear program that everybody else will have. And when I say nuclear, I mean nuclear energy. I feel like I have to keep rephrasing that because people just look for any little bit to cling to that Iran may be seeking nuclear weapons. And it's just not true. Right. Trump's last complaint here is that this does nothing to address Iran's the other issues with Iran, and he cites here Yemen and Syria, saying that this didn't resolve Iran's issues in these two countries. But if you look at what Iran has been doing in the Middle East, specifically in Iraq and Syria first, so you notice how he doesn't cite Iraq because the United States was actually fighting on the same side of the Iranian Ba'ath militias in Iraq. However, in Syria, the United States is not fighting with the Assad government and with those forces against Al-Qaeda and ISIS. At times we were helping Al-Qaeda and ISIS. At times we've been fighting against them. And at other times we've been preventing the Syrian government and their allied forces in Iran, Russia, and Shia militias from attacking the terrorist group. And then in Yemen, of course, and this just really shows how little Trump actually understands about the nuclear agreement and the politics of the Middle East and the history of the Middle East and what's even happened there in the past few years, that the United States and the war in Yemen that was entered into by Saudi Arabia and the United States happened in 2015 after the nuclear agreement was being signed and put into place because the Saudis were worried that the United States was moving too close to Iran in the Middle East and that the deal would work out. And so Yemen was an effect of the nuclear deal, not something that could have been possibly resolved by. Okay, now I guess I could get on to the next clip.
In other words, at the point when the United States had maximum leverage, this disastrous deal gave this regime, and it's a regime of great terror, many billions of dollars, some of it in actual cash. A great embarrassment to me as a citizen and to all citizens of the United States. A constructive deal could easily have been struck at the time, but it wasn't. At the heart of the Iran deal was a giant fiction that a murderous regime desired only a peaceful nuclear energy program. Today, we have definitive proof that this Iranian promise was a lie.
So we start here at what was going on in the Middle East leading up to 2015, and really, going back to the U.S. interventions in the start of the terror war. Of course, the Taliban government of Afghanistan was an opposition government to Iran. Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi government was a very strong opposition to Iran and have fought brutal wars against the Iranian government in the 80s. Were overthrown and taken down by the United States. Then the United States took the side of Osama bin Laden's allies in Syria, and that led to a spillover of those allies in Iraq, presenting the opportunity for Iran to be the savior for both the Syrian government and the Iraqi government to come in and prevent the flooding rise of Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria and Iraq. These were all actions by the United States government under both the Bush and Obama administration that strengthened and expanded Iran's role in the Middle East. And of course, if you look at Hezbollah was a group that was created in reaction to the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon. And again, you have this time a U.S. ally carrying out of action that was created such a horrible situation that Iran was able to expand their influence to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And so, no, in 2015, there wasn't a point of maximum pressure for Iran. Basically, what Iran was able to do is it was a good deal for them. It was a good deal for the United States in reality, because there was such a completely false narrative that Iran was pursuing nuclear weapons, that Iran was able to sign a deal agreeing not to pursue the nuclear weapons that they weren't already pursuing. And in exchange, the IAEA would further monitor their civilian nuclear energy sites, which they were only using for civilian energy anyways. Now, I'm sure there was some real losses in their heavy water reactor and some other things, but that was supposed to be offset by the sanctions relief. Now, unfortunately, I think it's largely been because of the hawkishness of the United States and the Republican Party that's prevented the Iranian nuclear deal from really benefiting the people of Iran. As I've discussed on previous shows, if you're a country from the outside like Germany, the United States, France, looking to invest in Iran or, create business ties with Iran, this is going to cost money and capital investment. And if you constantly have a president of the United States, of course, right after the nuclear deal is signed, you then have the 2016 elections and presidential primaries, and the Republicans were literally crawling over each other and completely all outdone by Donald Trump, who called it the worst deal ever, to vacate the nuclear agreement. And so I think, this has prevented a lot of companies from wanting to do business with Iran. It's just the threat that business could be illegal in a few months. But the point being is that, no, Iran was not begging at the table for the United States to provide them sanctions relief in 2015, and Iran was not at their weakest point. However, Obama, if your goal was really, if the United States' only interest in signing that Iran deal, which, they say it is just making sure that Iran doesn't develop a nuclear weapon, then Obama created and signed a pretty good deal. Again, Trump talks about the cash, and this is something that's so stupid that it upsets him. Basically, what happened is in the 70s, or prior to that even, there was a dictatorship in Iran that was backed by the United States, and we were selling them weapons. The Iranian government sent the United States government a whole bunch of money to buy these weapons. The Iranian Revolution then happened, and the Iranian government was no longer allied with the United States. So it was obvious that the United States wasn't going to deliver the promised weapons to a now enemy state. However, they didn't give the money back either. International court ruling said that the United States had to give the money back to the Iranian government. And so in the nuclear deal, the United States agreed to, that they would, release those funds or unfreeze them and allow Iran to have that money back. Of course, we get more of the slander against the Iranian government. The Iranian government isn't a beautiful utopian free market paradise like I would prefer, and certainly isn't the most tolerant or liberal state in any means. However, by Middle Eastern standards, is really not that bad. And if you look at what the United States is doing in, let's say, Yemen or Afghanistan, what Iran is doing anywhere really isn't that bad at all. And so, the United States can assume no moral authority role to attack Iran on, behalf of what's right and good in the world. And then I find this last statement here really interesting. He talked about Iran, deserving a nuclear energy program. At least I think that's what he said, is the word deserve. Kind of talking about that, Obama should have negotiated that Iran could not have a nuclear energy program, which is completely ridiculous. This is a form of energy that is very efficient and very effective and worked well in Iran and worked for those people and provided them with energy. And so it's no business of the United States government to tell them if they can have that. Move on to clip 5.
Last week, Israel published intelligence documents long concealed by Iran, conclusively showing the Iranian regime and its history of pursuing nuclear weapons. The fact is, this was a horrible one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made. It didn't bring calm, it didn't bring peace, and it never will.
So here we get Trump citing his reason for leaving the nuclear agreement, I suppose. As I talked about on the last show, which I also covered on the nuclear agreement, and I'll link to in the show notes page, I had assumed if Trump was going to withdraw from the agreement, he would do so based on it was no longer in the national security interest of the United States to be in that agreement, and cite a portion of the legislation that the Senate used to pass the JCPOA or confirm it in the United States. However, he says it's because the Israeli government provided proof that Iran has a nuclear, or I guess has a history of pursuing nuclear weapons. So I want to get that clear. Now, if you look at the intelligence that Israel has supplied and then all the assessments of, what they were actually able to attain, there was nothing new. There was nothing that proved that Iran had any desire to seek nuclear weapons after 2003. And again, the show notes page, I'll link to an article by somebody much smarter than myself explaining how what the IAEA knew when Iran, when they signed the nuclear agreement. I guess they gave up all their information on their, past attempts at assessing the possibility of gaining nuclear weapons, and would have agreed to give over all their information on nuclear weapons that the Iranian government had pursued. And there was nothing new that the Israeli government provided from that. And so it's just a complete outright lie to cite this as the reason. Okay, moving on to clip 6.
In the years since the deal was reached, Iran's military budget has grown by almost 40%, while its economy is doing very badly. After the sanctions were lifted, the dictatorship used its new funds to build nuclear-capable missiles, support terrorism, and cause havoc throughout the Middle East and beyond.
Okay, so in this we get a complete outright lie by Trump, and that is the Iranian government has used the money to make nuclear-capable missiles. The Iranian government has a ballistic missile program with a range that caps out at 2,000 kilometers. For anybody who has any question about that about gives Iran the ability to hit Israel, and that's the edge of their limits there. But those missiles are not capable of carrying nuclear weapons. Iran also has a space program, but I'll link to an article in the show notes page for those of you who are curious about rocket science as to why it's different to develop a missile program that could carry a nuclear weapon and a missile program to send rockets and satellites into space. And Trump talks about Iran spending all this money since 2015 in the Middle East. But if you look at what Iran has been doing in 2015 since 2015 in the Middle East, it's fighting ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Is Trump complaining that we gave the Iranian government their own money back so they could fight Iraq or ISIS and Al-Qaeda? It's completely ridiculous. Clip 7.
The deal's sunset provisions are totally unacceptable. If I allowed this deal to stand, there would soon be a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Everyone would want their weapons ready by the time Iran had theirs.
So I've already talked about the sunsetting stuff, but I did want to discuss this idea that there would be a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. First, this seems to not be true. If you look at, a comparable situation, the North Korean pursuit of nuclear weapons didn't make the South Koreans pursue nuclear weapons. If you look at just the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons and has had nuclear weapons, and yet Iran hasn't even researched developing nuclear weapons since 2003, really doesn't make sense as to why the deal sunsetting is suddenly going to cause a nuclear arms race. And as I said, Trump doesn't want to admit it, and the U.S. government doesn't admit it, but there's already a nuclear armed state in the Middle East, and that's Israel. And Israel's capable of delivering the missiles. Even if Iran were to have a nuclear weapon, they don't have the missiles or any ability to deliver it anywhere, very far off their own border. Play the next clip.
Making matters worse, the deal's inspection provisions lack adequate mechanisms to prevent, detect, and punish cheating, and don't even have the unqualified right to inspect many important locations, including military facilities.
So I've already covered the inspection stuff, but here I think it does a good job of just showing the absurd demands that Donald Trump has, or that he alleges to have, for Iran to be within a good nuclear agreement. And that is to allow for unqualified unfettered inspections of any site within Iran at any time, right? He wants the IAEA, or I guess any international weapons inspectors, to be able to drive into any secret Iranian facility at any time for him to consider it to be a good deal. This is something that no country would ever agree to, and that the deal provides the IAEA with the ability to inspect any site within Iran if the United States, the UK, France, and Germany agrees to it. And so the bar isn't set all that high. Next clip.
Therefore, I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. In a few moments, I will sign a presidential memorandum to begin reinstating U.S. nuclear sanctions on the Iranian regime. We will be instituting the highest level of economic sanction. Any nation that helps Iran in its quest for nuclear weapons could also be strongly sanctioned by the United States. America will not be held hostage to nuclear blackmail.
So here, I guess we have the actual official Big Bang announcement that Trump is reimposing the sanctions. I found the statement interesting that he said any country that helps Iran to get nuclear weapons may also be sanctioned. Interesting to hear how Trump interprets help. Does this mean just any country that does business with Iran is helping them to get nuclear weapons? Because as he pointed out in North Korea, it undermines our maximum pressure campaign. Or does this just mean a situation like if, for example, Russia were to sell Iran heat shields for their ICBMs, would that be a violation of the sanctions Trump's talking about? So it's really, not yet clear as to what he means by that, because he could be, talking about as far as threatening to sanction our allies if they don't also withdraw from the nuclear agreement. At no point here does he make an announcement on what our allies are going to do. Also find it interesting, this last part here, and it's very interesting in part because of the next segment as well. But he says the U.S. will not be held hostage by nuclear weapons. And it seems very interesting if maybe that's the way he now perceives the situation in North Korea. The fact that country was able to achieve a nuclear weapon, that they're not able to hold the United States hostage and force maybe not a completely one-sided deal. The next clip is about North Korea.
Today's action sends a critical message. The United States no longer makes empty threats. When I make promises, I keep them. In fact, at this very moment, Secretary Pompeo is on his way to North Korea in preparation for my upcoming meeting with Kim Jong-un.
So on the last show, I got into a little bit more detail than I will here about what impacts this may have on the nuclear agreement or any kind of deal to be made with Kim Jong-un in South Korea. However, or in North Korea. However, if Trump's demands on Iran are any indication of the demands he will have for North Korea, the deal there doesn't look very good either. Also, just kind of big news that's flying under the radar here is that Trump announced that Mike Pompeo, who is now Secretary of State, will be visiting North Korea, and Madeleine Albright was the only other, I believe, Secretary of State to meet a North Korean leader. So this is a pretty significant move. Too bad it's dumb, terrible Mike Pompeo who gets to make that meeting happen.
As we exit the Iran deal, we will be working with our allies to find a real, comprehensive, and lasting solution to the Iranian nuclear threat. This will include efforts to eliminate the threat of Iran's ballistic missile program, to stop its terrorist activities worldwide, and to block its menacing activity across the Middle East. In the meantime, powerful sanctions will go into full effect. If the regime continues its nuclear aspirations, it will have bigger problems than it has ever had before.
Okay, so it's very interesting that he says here, what we want to do is have a lasting solution to make sure Iran never ever gets nuclear weapons. And then he says, we need to make sure Iran stops funding terrorists across the Middle East. And it's like, what do these two things have to do with each other? If your goal is to prevent Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon, then the current nuclear agreement does just that, Donald Trump. He goes on to talk about the missile programs, which I've already discussed. They can't carry nuclear weapons, and for that reason, I think they're really just a deterrent, allow Iran to strike back against a country like Saudi Arabia, who has a military sold to them by the United States of America, or Israel, who has nuclear weapons. And of course, just that there would be more chaos in the Middle East if Iran wasn't doing what Iran is currently doing in the Middle East. Now, I'm not for expansionism and imperialism. I favor non-intervention and anti-war. But if you look at what Iran's role has been in the Middle East, Lebanon is now a counterforce, or Hezbollah, is now a counterforce to Israel and has prevented Israel, at least for the past 12 years, from invading Lebanon again. And Iran is fighting on behalf of governments fighting out ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria. The last thing was, the big threat to Iran by Donald Trump there. In this whole speech, he talks about how no country should ever be threatened by a nuclear weapon and how Iran should never have a nuclear bomb to threaten anyone. And then he threatens to wipe out Iran. I mean, you just can't miss the hypocrisy there. The next clip I'm going to play is just a message from Trump to the Iranians.
Finally, I want to deliver a message to the long-suffering people of Iran. The people of America stand with you. It has now been almost 40 years since this dictatorship seized power and took a proud nation hostage. Most of Iran's 80 million citizens have sadly never known an Iran that prospered in peace with its neighbors.
I mean, it seems just so ridiculous for Donald Trump to, in one sentence, say, I'm going to threaten Iran, then to say, I stand with the people of Iran. You can't have both, Donald Trump. You can't wipe out Iran and then stand with the people and help. This is the very last clip.
Iran's leaders will naturally say that they refuse to negotiate a new deal. They refuse. And that's fine. I'd probably say the same thing if I was in their position. But the fact is, they are going to want to make a new and lasting deal, one that benefits all of Iran and the Iranian people. When they do, I am ready, willing, and able. Great things can happen for Iran, and great things can happen for the peace and stability that we all want in the Middle East. There has been enough suffering, death, and destruction. Let it end now. Thank you. God bless you.
I don't have a whole lot to add to that last clip. I mean, I think it's mostly self-explanatory, but I think it's important Trump saying that, if Iran's willing to come to the table and I guess solve all the problems of the Middle East, which Iran couldn't do and the people of Iran couldn't do if they wanted to. So it seems that he's offering them, the ability to come to the table to make an impossible deal, but also where he says that, I wouldn't negotiate if I were their leaders. That seems, I don't know, that just kind of stuck out and was interesting to me. All right, so I'm going to wrap up with, kind of some final thoughts here. Very disappointing that we're out of the agreement. Maybe it's going to mean catastrophe in the Middle East. As I pointed out on the last show, there's a lot of potential roads that we could go from here as far as our allies staying in the agreement, Iran staying in the agreement, Iran breaking the agreement, Iran looking for nuclear weapons, what this means for Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon. There's a lot of possibilities and there's a lot of outcomes here that are definitely going to be unfolding in the days ahead. I think it's disappointing that Trump left the deal. I mean, if there's one or two good things that Obama did while president of the United States of America, signing this nuclear agreement with Iran was probably on the top of the list. It was a deal that allowed sanctions relief on Iran and then at the same time absolutely defeated or should have defeated every single possible fear that anybody in the West could have that Iran would actually develop a nuclear weapon or could actually develop a nuclear weapon secretly. I mean, that was completely taken off the table. And now the United States has kicked Iran out of that deal. And, we have a lot of things to happen here. And so I don't want to get into a whole round of speculation or anything because this has already been a rather long show. But just to say that I think that this speech in the end for me highlights that Trump really never understood the Iran nuclear agreement. And man, I mean, I can almost picture him signing an identical deal, thinking and then calling it the best deal in the world. Because, I mean, from the perspective of somebody who just wants to make sure that Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons, the deal was a good deal then. That's all there is to it. All right, I'll wrap up the show there. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com for those of you who want to share the show. Libertarianinstitute.org. You can find my daily news roundup there, which has some featured plays and the show as well. My new website is immersionnews.com. Really like the thing. Check it out. Cool stuff there. I'm on YouTube and BitChute, and the channel name is Immersion News. Facebook, I'm part of the Libertarian Union, which is a great group of libertarian podcasters who put out awesome content. Definitely check out their shows. And then on Twitter at KYAAALE. Patreon is /foreignpolicyfocus.